Welcome to this edition of the Fortnightly Express, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. My name is Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. Today, we have a real treat. We're going to be speaking to one of the best-known names in our hobby. Les Klinger is well known as an annotator, an editor, an author, a consultant, a lawyer, and a scholar. And frankly, there's so much to talk to about Les that I doubt we can get it all in today. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Les Klinger to the show. Hello, Les. How are you doing? How are you doing today?
Great. It's a hot day in Malibu today, but I've been inside in the cool library. So
it's a hot day here in central Indiana as well. That's one of the things I ask everybody is generally where they. So you're from Malibu, California. That's right? Yes.
Offices in Westwood, which is about 22 miles away. And generally, before we have before and after. Before, I was driving 22 miles each way to commute to my office, but here I am working at home.
Well, we're all doing a lot of that. So that gives us an opportunity to have this chat today. So I guess that's a bit of a silver lining. So,
yes.
So I think we would start. We've got, Les, you are so accomplished in our hobby that it's hard to know how to whittle down the topics here. But I think we'll just start.
Accomplished. I appreciate the word accomplished. I would have said busy. That's all. It's not necessarily accomplished. It's just a lot.
Well, it is a lot, and I've always been impressed with your staggering output. It's you must have either some secret formula for doing work or a tremendous work ethic or both. So,
somebody said vampire at some point, and that was a suggestion. But no, I think part of it, Steve, is the work output is related to my profession. I mean, I see sort of two categories of writers that function a lot like I do. Lawyers and journalists, both of whom understand writing is just one more kind of work, and you just get it done. I can't say to a client, "I'm sorry, I can't get your project done. I have writer's block." That doesn't go over very well. So you just get to it. I treat my Sherlockian writing and my other writing like one more work project, and so they sort of all get juggled constantly. Every single day I'm doing some of my day job and some of my night job and so on.
Well, that I can definitely relate to. Sometimes the line gets a little blurry. People ask.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I get that. I understand what you're saying. It's Let's fall back a little bit, though. How did you discover Sherlock Holmes?
Well, it goes. I mean, I can focus very specifically on what happened, and it wasn't like some of the other stories you heard from some of the other conversations. Mine occurred in law school. I had probably read some Sherlock Holmes along the way before that, but I was focused on science fiction. I loved science fiction, and that's all I really wanted to read for recreation. When I was in my second year of law school, my girlfriend, later my first wife, bought me a copy of Baring Gould. This was 1968. The book had just come out, and she saw it in the bookstore window. She said, "I'll bet Les would like that." And she bought it for me. And I was very focused on doing a certain quantity of recreational reading while I was in law school. My rule was study up until 11 p.m. and then 11 to midnight do some recreational reading. And I started reading Baring Gould, and I just got hooked. I was fascinated by the stories and by the footnotes, by this whole idea that there was, what shall we call it, a cult of Sherlock Holmes. And almost immediately subscribed to the Baker Street Journal and began to, in a very casual way, began to collect. After I got out of law school, I started to collect but I didn't know what I was doing with collecting, and I just started collecting. And it went on that way for a while. I was buying random Sherlock Holmes books. Um, I gave one or two talks about collecting. We used to go to a family camp, and I actually volunteered at one point to do a talk on introducing Mr. Sherlock Holmes. That was a new experience for me, but I loved doing sort of teaching, that kind of teaching, and that was fun. And then the next life-changing moment came sort of in the late 70s. I don't know if you remember that once upon a time the Baker Street Journal ran classified ads.
Oh, yes.
And there was,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and there was an ad in the Journal that a fellow in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, was selling his collection. It was $3,500. This was 1978. That was an enormous amount of money for me. But
That's 1978 money. That's
yeah, that was real money back then.
Real
kids.
money, yeah.
So I sent away for the list of what he was selling, and he was selling 300 books, and they were things that I had read about and never seen. They were some of the early Edgar Smith Pamphlet House publications, on and on, sort of the small press things that Sherlockians have been doing for decades, and that you can't just find by walking into a random bookstore. And I said, wow, this is a different animal. Talked it over with my wife, the same woman who bought me the Baring Gould, and she said, yeah, you're the kind of strange person who ought to be a collector. Go for it. So suddenly my collection went from about 100 books to about 400 books. And
I love,
by
the way, I don't mean to interrupt, but I love stories like that, because I had a very similar, I'm not, I'm relating, because I had a story like that when Pam and I were first married, and I was, we were young and broke, and you stumble across something and it's going to be a once in a lifetime thing, right?
Right. So this was, suddenly I had all these books, and I thought, well, I guess I ought to be a serious collector. Now, I don't know if you remember an essay called A Few Million Words About My Good Friend Sherlock Holmes, written by our mutual friend Otto Penzler.
Oh, yes, I do remember it.
It appeared in Murder, Inc., the book called Murder, Inc. And I said, well, that would be a good checklist. There's 100 books listed here. I'm going to collect them all. Well, I looked carefully at the list, and yes, there was a copy of A Study in Scarlet. I said, all right, well, maybe I'm not going to get that. And then the number 100 on the list, you may remember, was The Whole Art of Detection by Sherlock Holmes, no copy of which has ever been found. So I said, all right, I'm not going to get that. So, but there were 98 books left on the list, and it took me close to 40 years, but I got them all. And I just love collecting. I mean, you're either a collector or you're not.
Oh, yes, right.
And I discovered that I was a collector. I love being a collector. I did that until kind of the mid 90s, when I had decided the Franco Midland Hardware Company, I don't know if you remember, they were doing a sort of semi-academic program. You could get your bachelor's degree by taking an exam.
Yes.
You then went for your master's. You had to write 4 or 5 papers. And so I did that part. I wrote the papers, and I said, wow, I wonder if I could get these published anywhere. So I started sending them into Science Society journals, and they mostly took them. And suddenly I appeared in the Baker Street Journal. I was like, whoa.
That's a great,
and that was,
that's a big deal when you're, first time.
That was a big deal to me, to appear in the Baker Street Journal. It was back when Bill Cochran was the editor of the journal.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I sent to him, by the way, he very properly rejected. It was just too superficial. Didn't really sort of carry through. So I tried again, and he published an article shortly thereafter. And then we get to the big thing, which is that, I'm sorry, this is such a long story, but
it's okay.
Back when I read Baring Gould, I think that I don't know that I ever said anything to anybody, but I think I thought to myself, wow, maybe someday, wouldn't it be great if when I'm really old and retired, um, I sat down and I updated Baring-Gould? Because it's clearly going to be at that point, it'll be 30, 40 years old and it'll be out of date. And sadly, of course, he died before the book even came out. Um, so I sort of had that in the back of my head. And then Steve Doyle enters this story very shortly, by the way. So in the mid 90s, I had the crackpot idea that I would get started. I said, I don't really need to wait till I retire. So I started working on a couple of stories. First one I chose was the Abbey Grange. I'm not sure if it's a coincidence that that ended up as my investiture. Maybe Mike knew, I don't know. But the first one I worked on was the Abbey Grange, and I took that story and I copied all of Baring-Gould's footnotes and expanded them, sort of added a few more, tacked on material at the end of his, and so on. And I did 2 or 3 of those, and I shared them with some friends. Chris Roden, in particular. Chris looked at it and said, wow, this is really crappy. He said, first of all, you don't have the rights to use Baring-Gould's material. You know, you have to get rid of all of the stuff he wrote.
Rights? Who needs rights?
Oh, yes. Good point, Chris. And he had some other very good comments, and I took them to heart, but I wasn't going to let it go. So I showed it to 1 or 2 other friends, and one of them was a pair of guys named Steve Doyle and Mark Gagin, who looked at what I was doing and said, yeah. And we talked about it, and I had this crackpot idea of doing the stories sort of one at a time. And you or Mark then said, no, let's be a little more organized.
That would be me.
Okay. So we
I remember that moment. I remember getting it. I remember, because we, full disclosure, apart from working on the Journal and the Baker Street Irregulars podcast.
Oh, yeah, you have another job, right?
You have another thing, many hats here, and working in one half of Wessex Press and Gasgene Books. And we got your submission. Back in those days, things came in hard copy. That was so I remember sitting down and
it looked good too. I was a good word processor.
Oh yeah, well, it looked good, and I was because a lot of times that can be a barrier. All you writers out there. So it looked good, and I sat down with it, and I remember thinking, well, this guy's got a lot of confidence to think he can rewrite Baring-Gould, or I thought, wow, that's really ambitious. But I started reading it, and I remember thinking, there's something here. There's something here. Here we are.
You guys, I'm eternally grateful that you guys believed in me. And the result of that was that we decided to do them in sort of book order of publication. So the first thing we did was The Adventures. That came out, I think, in 95. Maybe it was a little later. Maybe it was 98.
96, maybe. I don't know. It was mid to late 90s, somewhere in that range.
Eventually a 10-volume set. But so I was doing them sort of one at a time. I was really excited. We won a couple of awards for the books, and I was starting to go to the Irregulars dinner. Then in the early 2000s, about 2002, out of the blue, I mean, literally, I'm sitting in my office practicing law, and I get a call from a senior editor at W.W. Norton, a fellow named Bob Weil, who said, the old Baring-Gould thing, we're going to do a new edition of it, and we'd like you to edit it. And it was like, me? I mean, I fell out of my chair, and he was going to pay me. There was going to be an advance and all that. So I of course said yes, and I had to go out and get an agent to represent me. Those books came out in 2000. The first 2 volumes came out in 2004. The new annotated Sherlock Holmes, really clever title too. The new annotated Sherlock Holmes. And to my shock, and you were there, I won the Edgar. I won the Edgar for the first 2 volumes.
Yeah, it was it was a sensation. It was
in my wildest dreams, that never occurred to me. But I had so much fun writing that book, and I loved what I discovered about the book world, beyond Sherlockiana, just to discover the world of authors and the mystery writers of America and groups like that. And so I wanted to do more. I wanted to do a lot more. So
Yeah,
at this point,
it's kind of been a gateway to what's turned out to be for you a very, I mean, you kind of cornered the market on annotated classic works, and I'm not even sure. I mean, I think I have them all, but I'm not even sure I can remember them all off the top of my head. I mean, I know it's Dracula,
Frankenstein, 2 volumes of Lovecraft, a new volume that I can't tell you about yet, where we haven't signed the contract for it yet, but in the same vein, you'll excuse the expression. Annotated American Gods just came out this year. That's Neil Gaiman's great fantasy novel. 4 volumes of the annotated Sandman, Watchmen annotated, classic American crime fiction of the 1920s. So, I mean, I counted it up, Steve, and if you cheat a little bit and you count the reference library as 10 volumes, and because they had separate pub dates.
Well, I count them separate. Yeah, sure.
Okay, and if you count the Sherlock, the Norton set is 2, because it came out in 2 chunks, and so on. I'm at 51 books, which is like unbelievable to me.
Wow. You know, these are all there's Sherlock Holmes, and then there's the horror genre, which I know you said you were a science fiction fan, and science fiction fans often kind of share a sister interest in horror. And then there's crime fiction, Victorian crime fiction. Do these, when you start really drilling down and going deeply into a new genre like this, or at least exploring further, and does it trigger that collecting bug in you? Do you start, I mean,
sadly, yes. First of all, I have a very bad tendency that when I even think about a project, I immediately run out and buy a bunch of books on the subject. So yes, and then once I get into it, especially on these crime fiction classics, for example, I've said to myself, well, I have to have a first edition so that I can proofread it. Now, in some cases, I haven't bought the first editions because they're just astronomically expensive. Some of the really nice things that I got when I was doing Sherlock Holmes were Victorian research. I mean, in addition to having a few books about Holmes, I also have a lot of sort of Victorian tools. So, for example, I have an 1888 Britannica. I have a 1910 Britannica. I have over here a collection of Baedekers for various countries from that era. That was also useful for both Dracula. I have the proper area of the world for that. And there's a Baedeker for Lovecraft. Lovecraft, interestingly, did a story about Egypt set in about 1920. And he heavily depended on 1910 Baedeker in writing that story. He didn't go to Egypt.
He used the same Baedeker now that you can reference.
Exactly. But I also have things like Brett's, and I have a Bradshaw's and things like that. And those are they're fun, but they're also serendipitous. You sort of go through them and you find things, and wow.
Yeah.
They're just amazing things to stick in somewhere. One of the sad things for many writers is that writers like our friend Laurie King do tons of research and then have to throw away 80-90% of it because you can't put that in a novel. I throw away nothing. It all goes into a footnote somewhere.
That's the beauty of the kind of writing you do. You get to find a place for, or make a place for it, is probably more accurate.
Yes, exactly right.
Hey, Les, let's take a quick break so we can hear a word from our sponsor.
You should subscribe to the Baker Street Journal because it is the place to learn about what's going on in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
The Baker Street Journal is hands down my favorite Sherlockian thing to read. When it comes in the mail, my night is planned.
The Baker Street Journal is the place to play the game. If you're a Sherlockian, you want to be able to do the game of understanding the times of Sherlock Holmes, the stories of Sherlock Holmes, what Sherlock Holmes is all about.
If you are not a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal, you have no idea what you're missing. This is hands down the best writing about the writings you'll ever find.
You'll find great articles about new discoveries that are being made every single day. But beyond that, you'll find out what other people are doing and how you can become more involved in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
So we're back here with Les Klinger. Let's talk. You brought up Laurie King. Let's talk about the Pastiche anthologies that you've done with her, and just how'd that happen?
Laurie and I have been friends for about 20 years, I guess. When I was doing the Sherlock Holmes books, I think it maybe actually goes back to the reference library. She was it must have been right after the first Norton volume came out. So that's 17 years ago. I was at a BoucherCon, the big mystery convention, and she was one of the speakers, and I knew who she was, and I went to her panel and said, we should know each other. And she said, oh, I have your book sitting right there on my shelf. So that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We have been good friends for many years now. And at an event, we always get, not always, but mostly we get paired on panels. We both are going to do a Sherlock Holmes panel or this and that. So we were at a Left Coast crime panel, and the organizers said to me, so who else do you want to have on the panel besides Laurie? So I looked at the attendees and I said, Michael Connelly, Lee Child, and Jan Burke. And they said, well, those are our guests of honor. I said, I know, but I know that they're all secretly Sherlock Holmes fans. I had actually met Lee at an MWA dinner, for example, and he said, you're that Les Klinger. I have your book set right above my desk.
There you go. Jan
Cool.
Burke.
Jan Burke is a local Southern California author. I met her many times, and Michael Connelly the same. So they were on the panel. We had a great panel. They'd all sit there on the panel saying, well, I don't know much about Sherlock Holmes, but, and then they'd say these incredibly insightful, erudite things. They clearly knew their Sherlock Holmes. So after the panel, I said to Laurie, what if we ask them to write something for us, to write stories for us? Doesn't have to be Sherlock Holmes stories, just inspired by the canon. And she said, sounds good, you'll do all the work? I said, well, no, but I'll do a lot of the work. So we put together an anthology called A Study in Sherlock that came out from Random House back in 2011, maybe, something like that. It included Lee, it included Jan Burke, it included Neil Gaiman, just an incredible roster of writers. Not Michael Connelly, he appeared in the second volume. He was too busy to do something for us right then. And what we've said to every one of the contributors has been the same. It's basically, we're not asking you to write a Sherlock Holmes story. We're asking you to be inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories. We've had an incredible roster of writers from other genres.
That was one thing I was going to mention, is that they're not all Sherlockians, and they're not even all crime writers. I mean, some of them are.
Right, not at all. We have tried hard to be inclusive of, first of all, they're all friends. They're all people where we could buttonhole them in the hall at a convention and say, so, Michael, would you write a story for us? First one is The Study in Sherlock. Second one is In the Company of Sherlock Holmes. Third one is Echoes of Sherlock Holmes. Fourth one is For the Sake of the Game. And we have a new one coming out in December called In League with Sherlock Holmes.
I would imagine, I'm just kind of projecting myself into your seat. And I mean, you have to approach it as an editor and that sort of thing. But as a fan, this has to be just about as much fun as you can.
It's fantastic. Because, I mean, you know, Laurie and I don't do a lot of editing. I mean, these are all very good, very skilled, very successful writers. And so their work generally doesn't need much editing.
Putting together a collection of work from your friends, but you're also a fan. And so it's,
Yes.
How great
Yes.
that has to be.
And fans of these writers as well as fans of Sherlock Holmes. And so, these have just been a joy to do, a real joy.
So as far as, I mean, for the reader, they're great. They're fun. I think I have all the ones that are out. I'd like to get them signed, but because I'm a collector too. And then, one of these volumes had a very serious, was a kind of a milestone work for another reason.
Yeah, a little problem.
Yeah,
So
tell us a little bit about that.
here's the short version of it. So the first volume, The Study of Sherlock, actually is what set this off. Random House got a letter from the Conan Doyle Estate Limited, which is the company that owns the U.S. copyrights, saying, you can't publish this book without our permission because you're using the character of Sherlock Holmes. Well, Laurie and I said, that's ridiculous. But Random House said, we're doing it anyway. We're going to pay them the license fee they're asking for. Just leave us alone. Okay. So then we switched publishers. We went to Pegasus Books for the second book of the series, and Pegasus has published all of them. And we had turned it in. We had some great writers, as I mentioned, Michael Connolly, too many to mention. And once again, we got a letter from the Conan Doyle Estate Limited saying, you can't do this, cease and desist. They said, we have relationships with Amazon. We're going to block distribution of the book and all that. And Pegasus, who hadn't printed it yet, freaked out, said, we can't pay the license fee. We're not Random House. And do you want to pay it? We said, not a chance. We'll take care of it. We said, big fools. We said, we'll take care of it. And we had the notion that we were going to sue the Conan Doyle estate and basically get a court to say, we're right, they're wrong. The character is in the public domain, is free of copyright protection. And so we sued the estate. Our friend Jonathan Kirsch handled the case. We won in the district court. The estate appealed. We went to the Seventh Circuit. We won. And in a scathing opinion, the judge called the Conan Doyle estate extortionists and basically said Klinger is to be commended for being a private attorney general. They awarded us all of our fees. The estate appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and that was the end of it. The matter was resolved. We ended up, fortunately, being very little out of pocket because the Conan Doyle estate had to pay the legal fees.
I remember when that was going. I mean, I know about copyright too, and it's a convoluted and tricky thing, particularly since this thing, the Sherlockian canon span. Part of it was in copyright, part of it was out, but
right.
And that kind of, but that was it was so we were all kind of wondering, well, it's not going to go, but the character.
Well, what the court said in short, what the court said was, look, true, there are 10 stories in copyright, but the character, to the extent that the character elements appear in public domain stories, you have to be able to use those. That's what it means that they're in the public domain. So, yes, the character elements that appear exclusively in the copyrighted stories, those are protected. What are those? The estate has tried to argue things like, well, Holmes in retirement. That's because I think the Lion's Mane and, the Lion's Mane was in copyright. We said, but Last Bow is not. So
right.
What do you mean? Retirement is not some protected concept, nor is the fact that Holmes got old. I mean, it's just, sorry, that happened. So in any event, it was essentially a complete victory. The estate has not quite let go yet, however. They continue to harass movie producers. They went after Miramax for the film Mr. Holmes and were basically beaten back badly. They went after Legendary Pictures, the producers of Enola Holmes. With both cases, I've been involved and basically told them, stand your ground. They have no case here.
And it takes
So,
deep pockets to fight that kind of thing too. So
well, that's
I
right.
think
I
we
mean,
kind of
that's
counted on the fact that people would just roll over.
exactly. And in fact, for many years they did. I mean, Warner Brothers rolled over, BBC, PBS rolled over and just paid them a license fee because it was easier than fighting.
Well,
I
that
mean, our
kind
case
of,
took about a year and a half.
yeah, I remember. Anyway, I remember Minnesota right after one of the Minnesota Sherlock Holmes conferences. This is right after the verdict, and you were introduced as a speaker, and or somebody raised a toast. I forget what it was, but it was standing ovation. Sherlock Holmes is free, and that was
Yeah,
a
well,
great
we
moment.
were fools. We were fools because we thought, oh, this is just going to cost a few $1,000s to go to court, get a decision, and it'll be over. Stipulated facts, no trial, nothing. We were off by a factor of about 20 or 30 or
Well,
40.
you never know how a court case is going to go. So
That's right.
you know that better than I do, that being a lawyer. So, but that's a natural segue into. I want to talk a little bit about. You mentioned some of the studios that have had to deal with some of these things, but I want to talk about your personal adventures in Hollywood because I've known you a long time, and to think that when we first met and we're looking at you're talking about your first book, and then next thing I know, my friend Les Klinger is like in Hollywood. So,
Well,
talk about some of your. We'll talk
some
about
of it's coincidence. It's just, some of it's just fortuity and sort of pushiness. I love that Lindsay Fay suggested the title, "The World's First Consulting Sherlockian" for me. But the story of the involvement goes like this. When the first Downey film was being shot, a mutual friend of the producer, our Cornelia Funke, who had been working with Lionel Wigram, who you may have met, he came to a VSI.
Oh yes, yeah.
And been working with Lionel on another project, and she said to me, "Lionel is producing a Sherlock Holmes film. You should talk to him." So I called him up and introduced myself, and frankly, I don't think he really wanted to have anything to do with me because I think he was very nervous about a fan, coming in and saying, "Oh, you're doing this wrong. You can't do this. You need to do that." But, we met, we talked, nothing much came of that. Then, coincidentally, another friend of mine, a client, said, "Oh, my good friend is up to direct the picture." By the way, he didn't get the gig to direct, but meanwhile, he should meet you because my clients all know that I'm a Sherlock Holmes nut. And so I met with that guy, and he came out to the house. We looked at books with the pictures of the characters. I read the script, gave him some comments. He didn't get the gig. All right, so what? Then one of my other little hobbies is cooking, and I regularly cook at the Malibu Kitchen, which is a takeout place here in town that has great food and good friends who run it.
Wait.
And
you just cook there? You just go and cook?
yeah, I just cook. So they said, so Robert Downey lives in Malibu. So apparently he came in the store one day, and the owner of the store said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm making a film on Sherlock Holmes." And the owner of the store said to Downey, "You should meet our friend Les Klinger, who's the world's greatest expert." So the next thing I know, out of the blue, I get a call from Robert Downey saying, "Hi, I hear you're an expert on Sherlock Holmes. I live about 3 miles away from you. Could we meet and talk about this?" And later he said, as he had done for Chaplin, he really likes to research the parts, and he was willing to fly anywhere in the world to meet with the great experts and to discover that one lived right in Malibu was wonderful. So he came over, and he had lunch. We spent hours talking about motivations and about Holmes in general. Again, I showed him pictures. And they didn't end up, I couldn't get a screen credit because it was sort of too late in the process, but I was pretty deeply involved. I mean, I read the script, gave them comments on the script, went on the set and did that. And then for the second picture, they called me up and said, "We're going to make you an official consultant." And they said, "And the fee will be X." And I'd been saving this line for years, Steve. I said to the guy, "That's great. You'll have to give me a few weeks to get the money together." He laughed. He laughed.
That-
But that's of course the
that's
truth.
fun.
Don't spread that around. But I would have paid them to be the consultant.
Oh,
So,
I get it. Oh, yeah, I totally get it.
So it was great fun. I read the script again, gave him comments on the script, flew to England, spent some time on the set, and so on. It was wonderful fun, and they were very respectful. And then you may recall, and this is a spoiler, I suppose, but in the second film, Holmes dies, and there's a funeral, and they said to me, what should go on Holmes's tombstone? Because we're going to show it on camera. And oh my God, what a great opportunity. I get to write his epitaph. So I did, and it's on screen for about a second.
You should screen capture that and frame it.
Yes.
Did you talk to any of the crew, for instance, on Elementary?
Yes. So you should recall that Rob Doherty, who was the showrunner, head writer, and I did an onstage interview way back when we did the UCLA Behind the Canonical Screen Conference, the BSI. And then coincidentally, it just turned out that a client of mine is the producer of the show, and it had nothing to do with the original interview. And so I got to sort of be in contact with Rob and the other writers, and they would email me every once in a while. They had my books on the set in the writer's room, and every once in a while they would email me with a question. But I wasn't sort of deeply involved. I really didn't have much to do with the scripts at all. And then, of course, at this wonderful conference called From Gillette to Brett, I got to do another long interview. That was I guess it was right after the 6th season. They had announced that that was the end, but then they said, oops, okay, we're going to do 6 more episodes or whatever they did, 10 more episodes for the 7th season.
Yeah.
But in any event, Rob and I did another long interview, sort of looking back at the series. I was very fond of that show. It's, I know there are people who hated it.
I thought Elementary was a great show, and
a lot of reverence for the canon.
It did, and it finished really strong. And I'm not sure I could say that about BBC Sherlock. I think it crashed and burned, but my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things in Elementary, it was like, yes.
Oh, I agree. I think the show is I think there's a lot of love for the Sherlockian canon in the show. I think it shows. So yeah, interesting. So we're getting on. I want to ask you a couple other things. You were talking about your, being a collector, and I know you've got some a couple of interesting items. Is there anything that you particularly would want to show off from your collection?
Sure. Well, a couple of things that I always show people when they come and see the collection. So I loved Ray Betzner's talk, by the way, and his spirit things. And I, too, have a copy of 221B. But this copy was bought from, I have 2 copies like this. This copy was bought from David Randall. So David, it was not directly, from his son, who was a book dealer. David was a very early Baker Street Irregular. He was, of course, the first curator, librarian of the Lilly Library, and built a fine collection there that included some Sherlockian stuff. There's a notation here in the book that says 1940 meeting BSI, signed by all members. Doyle's were present, Murray Hill Hotel. So that's the first 2 pages of the book.
Wow.
So I have another copy that was also at the dinner, and it has different signatures. Many of the same, but some of them different. So this is exciting to me because this is a link to the old Irregulars. The book came out in 1940. There are signatures here. Dennis Conan Doyle signed, and many of David Randall himself signed. Not this copy David signed, but many other recognizable names of some of the legendary Irregulars Frank Morley. I think my other copy has Chris Morley in it, and James Keddy, and so on. There aren't very many copies like this known. I think Randall Stock has an inventory. There are 7 or 8 copies that people know about from that dinner, and I'm very fortunate to have 2 of them.
You know, it struck me when you said it's a link to the old Irregulars. You know, you and I both sort of started attending the dinners, the Baker Street Irregulars, around the same time.
Yeah.
90s, somewhere in there. And of course, you know, the whole Sherlockian world has evolved and grown and changed and everything. So how important are those kinds of talismans, you know, these sort of links to an older era of the Sherlockian hobby? I mean, how does it speak to you? Because you clearly,
to me, clearly it does, and to me, it's very important because of my annotations. Because what I ended up doing when I annotated the canon was go back and read not just Baring Gould's annotations, contrary to what Chris Roden thought I was doing, but actually go back and read the source material that Baring Gould was using in the late 60s, which was all of these things that had been written by, as Christopher Morley put it, so few for so few. I basically, I have a complete run of the Baker Street Journal. Of course, now anybody can have that on CD-ROM, but I have it in paper. And I have many, many science publications. You talked about science societies in a previous show. You didn't really mention that some of the scions are very active in publishing scholarship.
True.
And so many of those authors are the old Irregulars. And so I have read and appreciated their work a great deal and know a lot of it well. I haven't memorized it, but I've read tons of it. And so, yes, those links are very important to me. Do your homework. And it's not just homework, it's enjoyable. There have been a lot of great minds devoted to a lot of silly things over a long period of time. You and me included.
Right.
Except for the great minds part. I was good. The silly things is what I meant.
Yeah, we're good on this. We're solid on the silly, that's for sure. And the work part of homework is not really work. It's fun.
Right.
It's fun.
Exactly. So yes, that is very meaningful to me. So the other item that I will show people is it takes a little explaining. So back many years ago, I've forgotten what year, the Queen of England decided to put together for charity the Queen's Doll's House. So the Queen's Doll's House is a magnificent miniature. Let's see, this is 1924, and it's a doll's house. Part of the doll's house is the library of the Queen's Doll's House, and they commissioned at that time a limited edition book because the library included actual books, little tiny miniature books that were mostly, I think, original, written for the Doll's House. And a fellow named Sir Arthur Conan Doyle found a manuscript called How Watson Learned the Trick. And he copied it over in his handwriting. And so the original of that is in the Doll's House. This limited edition book includes a reproduction of the manuscript. I'm not sure if you can really see it. The pages are like, you know, 1 inch by 2 inches or something. They're little tiny pages. And so this book itself, there's only 1,500 copies of the book, but it's got that important thing, How Watson Learned the Trick. This is the first publication of How Watson Learned the Trick.
Well, it's sort of the first manuscript reproduction, too.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. That's exactly right.
It's the first manuscript facsimile in our Sherlockian library.
You are correct. So those are just some of the fun things that I have.
Well,
you don't have to spend a lot of money on these.
No.
You just have to be assiduous.
Just got to be vigilant and narrow your focus sometimes too. I think that helps. And
yes,
look for something other people don't care about. I think that's a
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, I can tell you're about to ask me about that other strange thing I collect.
Well, yeah, briefly, we're getting on. I just want to touch on
Yes,
this. I know
okay.
that somebody said when I mentioned that, oh yes, I'm talking to Les Klinger. They said, be sure to ask you about your collection of Sherlockian pornography.
So once upon a time, I still remember the first time that my wife Sharon met Peter Blau. She met Peter at some cocktail party, and Peter came over and said, "Hi, I'm Peter Blau. I have the largest collection of Sherlockian pornography in the world." Okay. So
Wow.
flash forward, I realized that I was running out of things to collect in the Sherlockian world because that's a sad thing to say. But I really wasn't particularly interested in buying new pastiche. I'd stopped buying that stuff. So I wanted to think of something that I could collect that was sort of a new area, sort of subset that nobody was collecting. And I had realized from some other context that there had been an awful lot that had appeared in Playboy over the years. And I actually had written an article for the Journal about the connection between Playboy and Sherlock Holmes. That Hefner was a Sherlockian, and that's why I think the editorial command came down to include cartoons and essays and stories and so on. So first I started, the easy thing was to amass all the Playboys that had Sherlockian content, except I'm still missing volume 1, number 1. That's that issue with that girl in it, that Marilyn person.
What was her name? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very expensive. But I have all the other Playboys. But then as I was doing that, I said, well, there's more. And so there's a lot more Sherlockian pornography. And actually, my very first book came about, this is a great, I'll try and keep it short, a very collector kind of story. I was out to dinner with some friends. We were walking down the street in West Hollywood. And this is back in the day when adult bookstores existed. They had brown paper over their windows, and you had to pay $0.25 to get in.
Yes.
And one of the friends was an assemblyman. He was a state legislator. But I grabbed them and I said, we have to go in there. And they said, why? I said, because my antenna are tingling.
Yes, collectors
so we go in there,
have a sort of collecting radar.
The first thing I saw was The Sexual Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a paperback sitting on the shelf. Bought it and walked out. But I mean, that was the first thing I ever collected. But after that, I decided I would be a little more serious. I actually did a checklist of Sherlockian pornography, which Steve Rothman kindly published in the Journal. It's far from complete, but it's a pretty good list of things. Paul Herbert, the late lamented Paul Herbert, was also a collector of Sherlockian pornography, and I got a bunch from Barbara after Paul died, because she didn't want it. But no, there's gay pornography, there's hetero pornography, there's all kinds of pornography, and it's just fun because it's just sort of a little subset of collecting.
And it does kind of shine a light on that, how pervasive Sherlock Holmes is in our culture. I mean, no matter what, whether you're selling detergent or a girly magazine, you can find Sherlock Holmes. You know.
Absolutely.
Something for everybody, for certainly.
Yes.
Well, Les, this has been great talking to you. We're just about right up to our time limit here. I may end up having you back because I know there's 100 other things that I could talk to you about. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, Steve.
This has been great. And like I said, I may be knocking on your metaphorical door there again just to say, hey, let's have another conversation sometime.
It'd be a pleasure. And maybe at some point you want to put together something that's more than one person. It's,
yes, I actually have some ideas about that too. So great.
Great.
All right. Well, take care.
All right, Steve. Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
Take care. Thanks.
So that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for all the kind words and comments and feedback that we've been getting on the show, particularly the ones following last episode's interview with Carlina De La Cova, and all of the episodes that we've done. Your kind comments and encouragement is what helps us and inspires us to keep going. So be sure to post any comments or suggestions for future episodes in the comment section of whatever Facebook page you're watching this in, or you can subscribe to the Baker Street Journal YouTube channel and you can make comments there. So until next time, this is Steve Doyle saying goodbye.